Hi everyone, my name is Hayden and today we're going to be talking about higher order components. This is a topic that's not just about ReactJS, but it is commonly applied in the topic of ReactJS. So firstly, what is a higher order component? Well, a higher order component is a function that takes in a component and returns a new component. You can see on the left, and we already kind of know this from React, that when we have something like this app, this is a function that doesn't necessarily need to take in anything. It might take in something like props, but it returns a component. And we know that what it returns is a component because of the fact that what it's returning is JSX. The most common application of higher order components, or HOCs for short, is to implement a decorator pattern or something similar to that. So if you've heard of the decorator pattern before, you might be familiar with what we're talking about. But if you haven't, we'll still try and make it make sense to you. Essentially though, a higher order component, what it does is it's a function that takes in a component and it tries to do something to it, typically decorate it, in order to change it into something else. It's kind of like wrapping another layer of clothing around it. It typically doesn't modify the internals of the component that's passed in, it just dresses it up. It's like adding icing onto a cake, or 100 other types of analogies. So, again, I think the thing to keep in your mind throughout this is they're functions that return components that also take in components. Now, an example of a component, this has nothing to do with higher order components yet, is a car component. So what we have here is a simple car. It returns an H2 that says, I am a certain color car, and that color comes from a props argument that we pass into it. So I've imported that into my app.jsx. I then return that component, car color equals red, and what it will do is it will go and render me a car. It'll look like this, right? Now, naturally, it's a black and white page, but it says I am a red car. If I wanted to change that, I could change this to blue, and it would naturally update it as well. So that's my component. Now, what you'll notice in that component is the fact that I'm trying to console log the props. I would like to see those props when my program runs. Wrong tab, if I refresh the page here, you'll see that it says object color equals blue. So now what you think is, I would really like it if whenever I make a component, whether it's a car or a box or a train, I kind of want to be able to easily wrap some functionality around it where it will simply console log the props out for me. So what I can do is I can go and create a higher order component for myself like this one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open my file with props logger. It just contains the top section from that code. And let's pay attention to this really carefully because I think the details are going to be important. So what you're seeing here is you are seeing an instance where I am passing in a component, and all my function is doing is returning that component and passing through the props as well. It's a very tricky piece of code to understand. I think like these simple examples sometimes don't do it justice, but at the core of it, what you can kind of imagine is to say, well, okay, if I was to come down here and I would say something like, wrapper component, or new component equals something that takes in props, and all it's going to do is return wrapped component and then pass in the props. Because remember, using the spread operator in this context simply passes those props through. So this would be a completely useless component, right? Because all it's literally doing is returning another component totally. So it's a completely benign abstraction. And that's kind of like what we have here, because I could kind of write this differently if I wanted to and say something like this, new component. And I could probably go and place this up here and it might make slightly more sense to you, where I say, yep, I'm going to create a new component that simply returns wrapped component. And then I'm going to return that component I've created. Now, the reason that you might go and create this funny little middleware, if you will, is because now I can do something like console log props. So now what's happening is that this function takes a component and then it simply returns me the component with a little wrapper around it that console logs it. Now, this by itself isn't particularly useful, but what I can do with it is quite useful because you can see I'm exporting it. If I go back to my car file, I can actually import my with props logger from my with props logger file. Right now, again, that by itself doesn't really do much. However, instead of saying I want to export default car, I can actually say I want to export default with props logger car. Now, when I refresh the page, you'll see there's a lot of console logs, and I actually don't need this anymore. We can kind of unpack exactly what's going on here, because now what's happening is that this car function hasn't been modified, right? So the car component or functional component, whatever you want to call it, is the same. It simply returns an H2. But what this file returns is no longer just a car. It returns the result of calling the with props logger function that passes in a car. And let's think back to what is a higher order component. It is a function that takes in a component, the car, and it returns me a new component. And all this new component does is console log the props and return the car. So I've kind of gotten right in the middle of it there. And in this case, that is how we create a higher order component or a little wrapper like this, or decorating it, whatever you will. And that's great because we could add more functionality here too if we wanted to. I am a wrapper. I could add that in. And now any component I call, whether it's car or something else that I apply this function to, would have that effect. So for instance, you know, if I went and made a train component, I could do with props logger on that one as well. So if we move on to another example, maybe one that'll make more sense to you, I've got a more detailed function here that's a higher order component. You can see it in this file. It's called make expandable collapsible. And it's essentially where what we want to do is we want to be able to take a component we've already created and then allow it to be shown or hidden with a button there that toggles it. So if we look at this component here, I've tweaked it a little bit just to kind of match our previous code example where it's like I'm showing you that we are creating a whole new component called new component that takes in props and it does a bunch of stuff. And then we return that new component. That's the job of the function. And you can see here, it's got a simple use state to kind of toggle on and off shown. It's like a true or false. The actual return from the component is a button where, you know, as you click the button, it kind of goes show, hide, depending on whether it's true or false. And only when shown as true do we actually render the component we're wrapping. So that's really interesting because if we come back to, you know, this blue car example, I could import a different function. I could import with expandable, let me find the exact name of it for you. Yep, with expandable collapsible here from the file make expandable. I named the file a bit shorter. And now instead of using with props logger, I'm going to use this one. And what you'll see now is suddenly there's a hide show button like this. And this is really cool because remember, again, we haven't modified the car. It's just if I create a component called car, instead of exporting the car by itself, I can export a version of it that's been decorated or wrapped with some extra functionality, which in this case is to simply add a button to it and make it hidden or shown. And that's a great thing because you might be creating many different types of components and occasionally you want them to have the same kind of wrapped functionality, right? So it's really a way of saying wrapping components. One of the most common ways you'll see this done is for things like authentication or login. So if you want to have certain components that, you know, there's preconditions of how those components are loaded, for instance, that someone has to be logged in, or that you always want it to have the same header or footer, that's one way of doing it as well. There's a few different ways to do things in React, and this is just another tool in your arsenal. So the overall benefits are that it allows us to reuse the logic surrounding components, so you don't have to kind of copy and paste code. And that's great because you can have multiple components that reuse the same logic. It also doesn't have any side effects, and this one's kind of important in terms of like when you make the car component itself, the car component always stays the same, and when you wrap it, you're not going to kind of mess with what's inside the car component. So it makes the code a little bit more robust in that way. There is one final example that I would love to chat through you all with just to really nail this topic before we wrap up, which is a full example. So what you can see here is a piece of code, a simple React app. This is the sample code that we provide you with for this lecture. And on the right-hand side, you can see a really basic web page. Now, the web page is made up of an H1, and then we have 5 different elements. We have 2 link tags, if you will, and 3 button tags. Now, what you'll notice is that firstly, the link tag is just defined as a URL up here, like an href kind of thing. However, this link with click tracking is defined as a link, but with a higher order component with click tracking. So you'll see up the top of the page here, we have a higher order component with click tracking that takes in a component, which we call wrapped component, and it simply returns us a new component that is a pretty benign wrapper of it, except there's a div that wraps it that listens for a click, and when you click, there's a console log. So on this first one, you'll see if I click on it, nothing happens. But in the second case, something appears in the terminal. And you should also be able to see that number here increasing when I click it. And then we can see the exact same behavior with a totally unrelated component, in this case, a button, right? A button that has a label of no tracking. That's what's inside the text. Nothing happens when I click that. However, I'm going to create a new component called button with click tracking, which is simply wrapping the previous one with click tracking. One thing I did kind of gloss over is the fact that you'll notice that the new component that's generated from, the higher order component function actually looks for a prop called tracking info, which is why this link with click tracking has a tracking info prop. And this one also has a tracking info prop down here. And you can see that I can use this in 2 different occasions with different tracking info. So that one comes up and says, button 1, this one says button 2, and therefore I can track them kind of different. But the main point here is that I have added the same functionality to a link and to a button, and then I've been able to use that button with 2 different pieces of tracking info, all with the same higher order component at the top here, because this is really where the magic happens up the top, because everything else is pretty stock standard otherwise. But hopefully that example gives you a bit more depth, and you can also, go and copy that one yourself and play around with it and get more comfortable with it. Hope that all made sense. If you do have any other questions, obviously reach out to the team. Otherwise, that's higher order components. Thank you.